From 1958 to 1962, China tore itself apart in what is one of the most unnecessary and devastating events in all of world history. This period became known as the Great Leap Forward, and there's certainly an underrated brutality to the whole thing. When most people think about the dangers of communism, the first thing they jump to is the Soviet Union, and rightfully so. A mixture of communism and totalitarianism left tens of millions of people dead. But if you ask the average person what the Great Leap Forward was, my guess would be most people probably have no idea. There really aren't any famous battles or courageous last stands. It has none of the ghastly pictures you'll see from stuff like the Holocaust. There's no famous museums dedicated to the victims of the Great Leap Forward. The only thing you'll find if you go on the internet and do a Google image search is that you'll see pictures of these strange-looking clay huts that look more weird than intimidating. You'll see masses of people digging in fields and digging irrigation ditches, and it all doesn't look very menacing at first glance. But once you dive into the research and begin to understand what actually happened, you realize that 40 to 50 million people died as a result of the policies of the Great Leap Forward. That's more than twice the amount of people who died during World War I. Make no mistake about it, the Great Leap Forward was unmistakably hell for the people who lived through it. Beginning in 1949, China was officially controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party was led by a guy named Mao Zedong. And Mao was the leader of the party when, of course, they were going through the Chinese Civil War before, during, and after World War II. So Mao and the Communist Party joined up with certain elements of the military, and they essentially rebelled against the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Now, both of these groups formed an uneasy alliance during World War II in order to fight off the Japanese who were invading parts of China. But once World War II was over, the communists and the nationalists went back at it, and Mao and his Communist Party end up on top. By 1949, they're in control of China. And this is a huge deal for a variety of reasons, but for a country like the United States, it became apparent that now all of a sudden you have two of the biggest countries in the world who have turned to communism. And that would be the Soviet Union and now China, of course. Of course, the Soviet Union and China would become natural allies, but it wasn't always a healthy relationship. Mao kind of looked towards the Soviet Union, and oftentimes he felt like it was a big brother, little brother relationship. So Mao is a guy who's driven by pride and ego, and he felt like he could essentially do things better than the Soviet Union was. Mao viewed the Soviet Union as socialism and not true communism. So he had a real pride in developing a true communist state, and he wanted to do this while also catching up to the Western powers. So Mao felt that not only could he create a communist utopia, but he also wanted to catch up with countries specifically like the Soviet Union and the United States and Great Britain in particular. He wanted to catch up with these countries as far as industrial output and agricultural output and basically just modernize his economy and his society for the people of China. He often described it as walking on two legs. And what he means by walking on two legs is agriculture would be the first leg and industry would be the second leg. So the beginnings of the Great Leap Forward are Mao's belief that he can catch up with countries like Great Britain and countries like the United States in a mere 15 years. And he's catching up as far as industrial output goes and as far as agricultural output goes. So in order to do this, Mao is going to use China's greatest asset. And China's greatest asset is its absolutely massive labor force. The basic idea behind the Great Leap Forward was that Mao was going to collectivize everything. So in local villages and towns, jobs and money and personal items no longer had any meaning because everything belonged to the group. Mao was going to assign these huge groups of people massive projects to industrialize and modernize China. And all of this, of course, is justified as progress towards the utopian vision. And even though there might be some hiccups along the way, as long as we're making progress, the ends justify the means. Here's historian Frank de Cotter essentially summarizing the entire Great Leap Forward. Quote, "In the pursuit of a utopian paradise, everything was collectivized, as villagers were herded together in giant communes which heralded the advent of communism. People in the countryside were robbed of their work, their homes, their land, their belongings, and their livelihood. Food, distributed by the spoonful in collective canteens according to merit, became a weapon to force people to follow the party's every dictate. Irrigation campaigns forced up to half the villagers to work for weeks on end on giant water conservancy projects, often far from home, without adequate food or rest. The experiment ended in the greatest catastrophe the country had ever known, destroying tens of millions of lives." End quote. To me, that's a really great summary of what the Great Leap Forward was all about. It is important to note, however, that not everyone in the Chinese Communist Party was 100% on board with what Mao was thinking here with the Great Leap Forward. There were people underneath Mao who worried that massively collectivizing everything so quickly and trying to essentially outpace Great Britain in a mere 15 years could actually destroy the economy and ruin the lives of millions, which of course it did end up doing. These people preferred a more gradual approach to economic modernization. But there were a couple things that happened during the 1950s that allowed Mao to kind of take control of the party even more firmly than he already had control. I mentioned earlier that China's relationship with the Soviet Union was often seen as kind of a big brother, little brother relationship for Mao Zedong. And he felt like China was kind of getting the short end of the stick, and he felt like China was the true spirit of communism, whereas the Soviet Union was kind of a socialist version of communism. And at the heart of this was really Mao's relationship with Stalin. And it's difficult to understand kind of looking at it from so many years after the fact, but at the time, Stalin was, of course, the leader of the communist revolution. And if you know anything about communism, this is supposed to be a worldwide revolution that's supposed to spread from country to country. And quite honestly, there's a lot of evidence that shows that Stalin didn't really like Mao very much at all. Stalin, of course, was a notoriously paranoid person. He might have feared that Mao would be kind of gunning against him as far as becoming the leader of the worldwide communist bloc. Whenever Mao would go to visit the Soviet Union for diplomatic reasons, Stalin would often house him in very inadequate housing situations, kind of just small lodgings not befitting someone of Mao's stature. Of course, this would annoy Mao. Stalin would often just leave him there for weeks on end without sending anybody to entertain him or tell him what's going on. And then when they finally did meet, Stalin would often be dismissive of Mao and his ideas and kind of just brush him off as nothing more than the little brother that he was. But all of this changes when Joseph Stalin dies, because now all of a sudden Mao has the opportunity to kind of take that mantle as the person in charge of this whole thing, this whole worldwide operation. And Mao really does take this to heart. He was a person with huge amounts of pride and huge amounts of ego, and taking this opportunity was not something that he was going to let up. Mao would have a much better relationship with Khrushchev, who comes after Stalin. It was still a frosty relationship, but at the end of the day, Mao felt like he had more support from the Soviet Union, and this allowed him to kind of get through more of his policies, in particular the Great Leap Forward in China. Now, the next thing that's going to bolster Mao's presence in China is going to be the Korean War. In the early 50s, the United States gets involved in the dispute between North Korea and South Korea, and of course China kind of throws its weight behind communist North Korea. The Korean War is an underrated and brutal affair in its own right, and it probably doesn't get the recognition it deserves, but at the end of the day, it kind of ends in a stalemate. So Mao can use this stalemate as an opportunity to start the propaganda machine. And to the people in China, he's the one that kind of threw off the United States imperial aggressors. And whether or not that's actually true or not is irrelevant, because Mao can now use this as propaganda. The last thing that Mao would do in order to kind of consolidate power before his great leap forward was he would just purge anybody who didn't agree with his philosophies. And Mao was very clever with the way he did this. So a lot of times he would create these big events where he would want people to get together and he would want them to create an open political climate. So one of these examples of an open political climate was the 100 Flowers campaign. And he wanted all the local kind of cadres, local level communist guys, and even the higher level guys to kind of get together and discuss some of the issues that communism was having in China. He wanted to make it safe for people to disagree with the regime and maybe come up with some better ideas. And of course, all this sounds like a really good idea, but what actually was happening was that Mao was creating this open political climate. He was waiting for anybody to disagree with him, and then he was identifying and labeling anyone who disagreed with him as, quote, a rightist. So anyone who was foolish enough to speak out against some of the atrocities that were happening in China immediately got labeled a rightist and was purged from power. Oftentimes these people were beaten or humiliated. Oftentimes they were sent to labor camps where they just simply disappeared. And sometimes they were just removed from any position where they could hurt Chairman Mao. So much for freedom of speech, right? So these purges that would happen over and over again during the 50s and even into the 60s, of course, led to the development of a cult of personality. So Mao became almost a godlike figure, and anybody who disagreed with essentially anything he said was going to be removed. And make no mistake about it, the people of China, and in particular the people of the party, got the message. Here's a party member talking about his relationship with Mao. Quote, "We must have blind faith in the chairman. We must obey the chairman with total abandon." End quote. And a lot of people joined this cult of personality willingly, and a lot of people did it because they knew that if they didn't, they themselves could be in danger, or even their families could be in danger. So Mao was successfully able to create this world where he could do no wrong. But not everybody followed along with Chairman Mao and what he was doing. Some of the local level, they're called local cadres, or local people at kind of the village level, the people in charge of the party at that level, often disagreed with the stuff that Mao was doing. Here's one of those more moderate local leaders disagreeing with Chairman Mao. Quote, "The peasants are the same as beasts of burden today. Yellow oxen are tied up in the house and human beings are harnessed in the field. Girls and women pull plows and harrows with their wombs hanging out. Cooperation is transformed into the exploitation of human strength." End quote. So here's a leader who's obviously critical of Mao and his collectivization policies. What would end up happening to people like this? Well, a lot of times they were simply hunted down and they were sent to labor camps, or their families were leveraged against them and they kind of had to fall in line or else bad things would happen to them. A lot of the other local level leaders could see which way the wind was blowing and they followed along with what Mao Zedong was doing. A lot of the local cadres fell in line with what Mao was doing, but a lot of them actually became even more extreme, going overboard with policies of stringing people up and rounding people up who didn't agree with what Mao was doing and creating a society of repression and danger. Now that Mao had purged the party and purged local leaders of anyone who was moderate or anyone who might have gone against him, he went on to set up a sort of review system for everybody. So a directive would come from Mao, it would go down to the province level, and then from there it would go to the city level, and then from there it would go to the local level, and then from there it would go to the individual level. So an individual or a province or a city could earn a white flag, which means if you didn't hit your target numbers that Mao set out for you, you earned a white flag. If you just kind of barely met the numbers, you would receive a gray flag. And if you exceeded the numbers significantly, you would earn a red flag. So of course the white flag was used as a symbol of humiliation, which would of course encourage people not to earn a white flag. And red flags would be used as reinforcement for a job well done. Now this flag system and review system actually created a China where everybody was competing with everybody else in order to get the highest numbers. And people became obsessed with, quote unquote, launching a Sputnik. So obviously this comes from when the Soviets launched Sputnik up into space. Launching a Sputnik in China kind of meant putting up huge numbers or setting a new standard for whatever target output you're trying to produce, whether that's grain or steel or whatever other product Mao wants you to produce. And it's interesting because we always think about communist societies as not having as much competition as a capitalist society. And while that's certainly true to an extent, there was some fierce competition between different provinces and different cities and different peoples trying to launch that Sputnik and trying to produce huge numbers to impress the chairman. The problem was that the competition was coming from a place of fear. And competition that comes from a place of fear is not going to be as effective as competition that comes from a more healthy place. And Mao knew this, he just didn't care. So he said, quote, "What we call comparison is really compulsion," end quote. So he's saying that the competition they're fostering is just, it's all a facade in order to compel the people to do what he wants. And once it became clear that if you were not meeting your numbers and if you were earning a lot of white flags, bad things could start happening, people became obsessed with meeting those numbers. And they would do whatever it took to do that. Here's a local villager talking about his experience with white flags and red flags. Quote, "That year we pooled all our able hands together to work on water well drilling, leaving spring farming unattended. The prefecture party committee held a assessment and comparison meeting at which we received a red flag for well drilling and a white flag for spring farming. I went back to the county party committee to report this and got blasted by the party secretary. How could you have left with a red flag but come back with a white flag? I realized then that the problem was very serious. I myself could be picked as a white flag. Thus I had to leave my sobbing wife, who was due to give birth soon, and my dying sister, who was infected with tetanus, to go back to the work site in the mountains." End quote. People's houses were torn down in order to produce more steel output. Pots and pans that were essential to creating food for your family were taken in order to produce more steel output. Hair was torn off of women's bodies in order to produce fertilizer. Feces were kept and saved and collected in order to produce better farming conditions. People were tied up and put on parade as scarecrows in the fields in order to show people what would happen if you didn't comply and reach your numbers. All of this in the name of the greater good. The ends justify the means for Chairman Mao Zedong. And that's not me psychoanalyzing Mao Zedong decades later. Listen to his own words. So here he's talking about essentially the extent he's willing to go in producing a true communist society. Here he's talking about if his policies led to a World War III. Quote, "Let us imagine how many people would die if war breaks out. There are 2.7 billion people in the world, and a third could be lost. If it is a little higher, it could be half. I say that if the worst came to the worst and only one half dies, there will still be one half left, but imperialism would be erased and the whole world would become socialist. After a few years, there would be 2.7 billion people again." End quote. So Mao Zedong is literally willing to kill billions of people in order to get what he wants. He's literally willing to kill as many as it takes in order to produce his true communist vision. So if you're a person that thinks that the ends justify the means, you might want to consider some of the situations in history where people have thought that. Once you start thinking that it's acceptable to kill 1.3 billion people in order to produce whatever vision you're trying to produce, there's no doubt that Mao could care less about the sufferings of the villagers and the local Chinese people that were suffering under his policies. He just didn't care. He was fond of the saying, "It's just one finger in 10. He would hold out all 10 fingers and he would point to one, and he would say, all of this suffering is just one finger. You still have the rest of your fingers, and at the end of the day, we're going to be producing a better society for more people. It's all for the greater good." What would happen if you pointed out to Mao that the better analogy would be 9 fingers in 10 are the ones that are suffering, and the one finger is the finger that's doing well? Well, you would probably be sent to the labor camps. By the time the Great Leap Forward was officially ready to get underway in 1958, Mao had put together all of the elements needed in order to create a true regime of terror. When all was said and done, in a mere 4 years, 40 to 50 million people in China would be dead. Massive communes were established in order to produce bigger amounts of grain and agriculture and steel and industry. It didn't matter if you were old or sick or a child, you had to work in the fields and you had to produce output. Many people were simply worked to death during this time. At least 2.5 million people were tortured to death for simply not agreeing with Chairman Mao or simply suggesting alternative solutions to the problem. 40% of the total houses in China were torn down in order to produce steel and industrial output. Not only were families and individuals destroyed, and not only were their homes and their personal belongings destroyed, but really an entire way of life was destroyed during the Great Leap Forward, all in the name of raw materials and modernization. Pressure to reach numbers from local cadres led to corruption on all levels of Chinese society. You really did have to lie, cheat, and steal just in order to survive this terrible environment. Many did what they could in order to survive, including kind of hoarding your own food and trying to feed your own family. But if the roving bands of militia came to your house and discovered that you were hoarding food, you could be punished incredibly severely. Not only this, but because of the way the collectivization system worked, if you were hoarding food, this was taking away some of the food that was supposed to be going to someone else. So you might be saving your own family, but you were probably causing someone else to starve, in what is just one of the horrible ironies of the whole collectivist communist system. Famine was widespread, both as a result of the horrible policies of the Chinese Communist Party and as a result of the inefficiency of collectivization. Millions more people would starve to death, in addition to the devastating effects that the Great Leap Forward had on every other aspect of life for the average villager in China. Ultimately, the Great Leap Forward is one of the great ironies in all of world history. Mao wanted to produce a society where people wouldn't have to work anymore and people wouldn't have to deal with the sufferings and the difficulties of everyday life. But he ended up inflicting that very suffering and that very death and destruction upon the people that communism is nominally trying to help. Mao Zedong wanted China to walk on 2 legs with the Great Leap Forward. But within a few years, China was slowly crawling into its own grave. If you like this episode of the podcast, or any of the previous episodes, you can leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm told this helps spread the podcast to people who might be interested in listening to it somehow. So that would be fantastic if you could do that. If you didn't like the episode, you can leave me an angry tweet and we can talk about why it was terrible. Ultimately, I'm just glad you're out there listening. So, that being said, thanks for listening.